A general looks at a map. His army is advancing. The enemy is retreating. Victory seems possible. The general doesn't order his soldiers to dig in, doesn't order them to build trenches. Instead, he orders them to continue advancing, to pursue the enemy, to achieve a breakthrough. Days later, the general discovers his mistake. The enemy has dug in, has built fortifications. Now his army is stuck in open ground, exposed, vulnerable. The enemy attacks. The battle becomes a stalemate. This scenario repeated itself countless times in early World War I. Armies would fail to dig in when they had the chance, would fail to fortify their positions. Later, they would pay the price when the enemy attacked. Why did armies make this mistake? Why didn't they always dig in when they had the opportunity? The answer involves military doctrine. It involves psychology. It involves the mentality of generals who didn't understand the nature of modern warfare. Today, we're going to explore 15 reasons why armies in early World War I didn't always dig in. If you're interested in the strategic failures of World War I, the decision-making that led to tragedy, and the untold stories of military history, subscribe to Surprising. Every week, we explore how bad decisions changed history. Subscribe now so you don't miss our next video. Turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. The answers reveal why World War I became such a catastrophe. Reason 15. The cavalry mentality. This isn't the war our generals expected. At the start of World War I, generals still thought in terms of cavalry warfare. This wasn't a modern way of thinking. This was thinking that went back centuries. Cavalry was fast, mobile, could pursue fleeing enemies, could achieve breakthroughs. Cavalry could respond to changing situations, could adapt to unexpected developments. Digging in meant staying in one place, meant giving up mobility, meant becoming static. Generals believed that armies needed to remain mobile, needed to be prepared to pursue victory, needed to be able to respond quickly to opportunities. If they dug in, they might miss an opportunity for breakthrough, might miss a chance for decisive victory, might be unable to pursue a fleeing enemy. The cavalry mentality was deeply ingrained in military culture. Officers had studied cavalry tactics for centuries, had learned through military academies and experience that mobility was the key to victory. Digging in seemed defensive, seemed like giving up on victory, seemed like admitting that you couldn't win. So generals often chose mobility over fortification, chose to advance rather than entrench, chose to maintain the freedom to maneuver rather than the security of fortification. This worked in earlier wars when battles were decided quickly, when armies could maneuver and achieve victory. But in World War I, with machine guns and artillery, standing armies needed fortifications, needed to be protected from devastating firepower, needed to be able to withstand attacks from all directions. Generals were fighting a modern war with a cavalry mentality. We're using strategies that worked in the Napoleonic Wars or the Franco-Prussian War. But those strategies were catastrophically wrong for World War I. Reason 14. The belief in breakthrough. If we just push hard enough, we'll break through. Generals believed deeply that if they pushed hard enough, they could break the enemy's lines. This wasn't just a hope. This was a conviction, a fundamental belief about how warfare worked, believed that the enemy would eventually crack under pressure, would eventually retreat, believed that continuous pressure would lead to breakthrough, would lead to a sudden collapse of the enemy position, believed that breakthrough would then lead to pursuit, lead to the destruction of the enemy army in the open, lead to decisive victory and the end of the war. So they ordered continuous attacks, continuous advances, no pause, no consolidation, didn't stop to consolidate gains, didn't stop to dig in, didn't stop to fortify, keep attacking, keep pushing, break the enemy's will, break the enemy's lines, achieve breakthrough. The theory was elegant. The theory was based on how wars had been won previously. But the theory was wrong, catastrophically wrong. But the enemy didn't crack. The enemy dug in. The enemy fortified. The enemy established defensive positions that were nearly impossible to overcome. The general's belief in breakthrough was based on outdated military theory. In earlier wars, armies could be broken, could be routed, could be pursued and destroyed in the open. But in World War I, with modern weapons, armies could retreat to a defensible position, could fortify, could hold, could inflict devastating casualties on attacking forces. Generals didn't understand that breakthrough was no longer possible. at least not in the way they imagined. Didn't understand that the nature of warfare had fundamentally changed. Reason 13. Lack of understanding of machine gun effectiveness. Guns? How bad can they be? Generals didn't fully understand how effective machine guns were. They had heard reports from military observers, had read accounts from conflicts in the Balkans, but hadn't truly grasped the implications of machine gun effectiveness. A machine gun could kill hundreds of men in minutes, could sustain fire for hours, could mow down attacking soldiers like a scythe cutting wheat. But generals still thought in terms of traditional warfare. Thought that heroic charges could overcome machine gun fire. Thought that if soldiers charged fast enough, charged bravely enough, they could reach the enemy trenches, could close with the enemy and defeat them in hand-to-hand combat. Didn't understand that machine guns changed everything, changed the fundamental nature of warfare. Didn't understand that fortifications were necessary to protect against machine gun fire. Didn't understand that soldiers in open ground had no chance against machine guns in fortified positions. The generals would learn this lesson the hard way, through millions of casualties, through slaughters that would come to be known as some of the worst battles in human history. Reason 12. Time pressure and supply issues. We need to keep moving or we'll run out of supplies. Armies needed to keep moving to maintain their supply lines. Armies required vast quantities of food, ammunition, equipment, required constant resupply. Stop in one place for too long and supplies would run out. Lines would become stretched. Soldiers would run out of food, would run out of ammunition, would become unable to fight. So generals felt pressure to keep advancing, to move forward, to maintain momentum. Digging in meant stopping, meant establishing a defensive position, meant staying in one place. But stopping meant supply lines stretching longer, supply lines becoming more vulnerable to enemy attack, supply lines becoming harder to maintain, harder to protect. Generals thought it was better to keep advancing, to keep pressure on the enemy, to maintain momentum and not allow the enemy time to prepare. But this meant not fortifying, not digging in, not establishing defensive positions. The supply issue was real. Armies did need to maintain supply lines. But the issue was overestimated, overblown. Armies could have stopped, could have dug in, could have maintained supply lines. The technology existed to maintain supply lines, even with armies that were stationary. But generals were too focused on advance, on breakthrough, on victory, were willing to sacrifice supply security for the possibility of breakthrough. Reason 11, political pressure for victory. The government wants results. Governments wanted victory, wanted their armies to advance, to gain territory, to achieve something. Governments wanted to justify the war to their people, wanted to show that the sacrifice was worthwhile. A general who dug in and stayed in one place would be criticized, would be seen as lacking aggression, as lacking confidence in his army, would be seen as failing to achieve the victory that was expected, would likely be replaced by a more aggressive general. A general who would attack. So generals felt pressure to attack, to advance, to achieve something tangible. Digging in seemed like stalemate, seemed like failure, seemed like giving up. But attacking without proper fortification led to slaughter. Thousands of soldiers died in attacks that had no chance of succeeding. Died so that generals could demonstrate aggression to political leaders back home. Political pressure for victory led to military disaster on an unprecedented scale. Reason 10. Outdated military doctrine. We'll do what worked last time. Military academies taught outdated doctrine. The doctrine was based on wars from decades earlier, on Napoleonic wars, on wars from the 1800s, on military theory that had been developed over centuries. In those wars, fortifications could sometimes be overcome through determined assault. In those wars, breakthrough was possible, was achievable. Generals learned this doctrine in academies, were taught that aggression wins wars, that fortifications could be bypassed through rapid maneuver, through breakthrough. Trained soldiers based on this doctrine, based on this understanding of warfare, didn't realize that modern weapons changed everything, changed the fundamental nature of warfare, didn't realize that fortifications built with modern weapons in mind were nearly impossible to overcome, didn't realize that breakthrough was no longer a viable strategy. Outdated doctrine led to outdated tactics, led to strategies that were catastrophically wrong, led to soldiers dying in assaults that had no chance of succeeding. Reason 9. The illusion of control. We know what we're doing. Generals believed they knew what they were doing. believed they understood warfare, understood strategy, understood tactics. This belief was based on their military training, based on their experience. But their training was outdated. Their experience was from previous wars. Believed they could predict enemy movements, could anticipate enemy actions, could respond quickly and decisively to any situation. This illusion of control led them to take risks, to advance without proper fortification. Believed that they could respond quickly if the enemy attacked. Believed they had the situation under control, that they could adapt, but they couldn't. The enemy could attack faster than fortifications could be built, could move faster than generals could react. The illusion of control was a dangerous thing, a delusional thing, led to miscalculation, led to disaster on an enormous scale. Reason 8. Officer culture and bravery. Real soldiers attack, they don't hide. Officers believed that brave soldiers attacked, that attacking was the sign of courage and honor, believed that aggressive action was the mark of a good soldier. A good officer. Digging in seemed cowardly, seemed like hiding, seemed like fear. Officer culture valued aggression, valued offensive action, valued taking the fight to the enemy. Defensive positions were seen as less honorable than offensive action, were seen as the refuge of the weak, the timid, the fearful. So officers ordered attacks, ordered advances, often against their own better judgment. But the culture demanded aggression. The culture demanded offensive action. This officer culture cost millions of lives. Millions of soldiers died in attacks that were glorified as brave, that were celebrated as honorable, but were actually stupid, were actually suicidal, were suicidal assaults against fortified positions with overwhelming firepower. Reason 7. Confusion about technology. Artillery will kill everything before we attack. Generals believed that artillery bombardment could destroy enemy fortifications, believed that artillery was powerful enough to kill all enemy soldiers, believed that if they just bombarded long enough, hard enough, the enemy would be destroyed, believed that infantry would then be able to advance into empty trenches. So they didn't see the need for their own fortifications, didn't see the need to dig in. Why dig in if artillery could destroy the enemy positions? Why not just keep advancing? But the artillery didn't work as expected. Enemy soldiers would survive in deep dugouts, deep underground shelters that protected them from artillery fire. Infantry would attack and be slaughtered by machine gun fire, by artillery fire, by every defensive weapon the enemy had. The bombardment would end, the infantry would advance, and would be cut down immediately. Generals overestimated the effectiveness of artillery, underestimated the importance of fortification, underestimated the importance of defensive positions for their own soldiers. Reason 6. Speed of technological change. Weapons are advancing faster than we can adapt. Machine guns were improving rapidly. Artillery was becoming more powerful. Technology was changing. But military doctrine was slow to change, incredibly slow. Generals couldn't adapt fast enough to keep up with technological change. By the time they realized machine guns were devastating, millions had already died. By the time they realized fortifications were necessary, the war had already become a stalemate. By the time they understood the changed nature of warfare, an entire generation had been slaughtered. The speed of technological change exceeded the speed of military adaptation. Technology was advancing. Doctrine was stagnant, leading to disaster, leading to the worst slaughter in human history. Reason 5. Assumption of quick war. This will be over by Christmas. Everyone believed the war would be quick. Everyone. Politicians believed it, generals believed it, soldiers believed it, the public believed it would last months, not years, definitely not a decade. So there seemed no need to dig in, no need to build permanent fortifications. Why invest time and resources in fortifications for a war that would be over soon? Why train soldiers in fortification construction if the war would end before they finished? Why develop defensive strategies if breakthrough was imminent? So armies advanced, expecting quick victory, expecting that the war would be decided in a matter of months, in a series of decisive battles. But the war didn't end quickly, didn't end in months. Months turned into years. Years turned into a decade of warfare. Armies that hadn't dug in early in the war would spend years trying to advance, would lose millions of soldiers in the attempt, would eventually be forced to build the fortifications they should have built years earlier. Reason 4. Underestimation of enemy capability. They're not that good. Generals underestimated enemy capability, underestimated enemy soldiers, underestimated enemy officers, thought the enemy was inferior, thought the enemy would break easily, didn't respect the enemy's soldiers, didn't respect the enemy's officers, thought that aggressive attacks would overwhelm the enemy, that the enemy would collapse, thought they were fighting an inferior enemy that could be beaten through superior aggression. But the enemy was just as competent, just as capable, just as well-trained. The enemy had good officers, had well-disciplined soldiers, had modern weapons. The enemy would dig in, would hold their positions, would inflict devastating casualties. The underestimation of enemy capability led to disaster, led to attacks that failed, led to casualties that were unnecessary, led to years of warfare that could have been prevented with proper respect for enemy capability. Reason 3, lack of coordination. We don't know what the other armies are doing. In the early stages of the war, armies weren't well coordinated. Different nations, different generals, different strategies. Different generals made different decisions, took different approaches, had different philosophies. Some generals dug in, some attacked, some did both, some succeeded, some failed, some were catastrophically wrong. The lack of coordination meant that there was no overall strategy, no unified approach to the problem of modern warfare, no shared understanding of how to fight this new kind of war. Each general was essentially improvising, making decisions based on their own understanding, based on their own military training, based on their own beliefs. Some made better decisions than others, but most made mistakes. The lack of coordination meant that lessons learned in one area weren't communicated to another area, meant that successful defensive tactics weren't shared with other armies, meant that armies had to learn through their own costly experience. Reason 2, arrogance and overconfidence. We're superior to them. Many generals were arrogant, believed their army was superior, believed their nation was superior, believed that superior morale or superior training would overcome superior firepower, believed that their soldiers would succeed where others failed, believed that they had the answers, that they knew how to fight this war. This arrogance led to unnecessary risk-taking, led to overconfidence in their strategies, led to assaults on well-fortified positions that had no chance of succeeding, led to disaster on an unprecedented scale. This arrogance was often based on past successes, on previous victories. Generals had won wars before, had achieved victories, had been celebrated, so they believed their methods would work again, didn't understand that the world had changed, that warfare had changed, that previous success didn't guarantee future success. Reason 1, the learning curve. We have to learn this the hard way. Perhaps the most important reason, armies had to learn through experience. There was no way to predict how modern warfare would develop, no way to know in advance what strategies would work, what strategies would fail. Generals had to experiment, had to try different approaches. Some approaches worked, some didn't. Some were catastrophically wrong. The ones that didn't work got millions of soldiers killed. But eventually, armies learned through bitter experience, through the blood of their soldiers, learned that fortifications were necessary, learned that you couldn't overcome machine guns with cavalry tactics, learned that breakthrough was impossible, learned that the nature of warfare had fundamentally changed. But this learning came at an enormous cost. The cost was the lives of millions of soldiers. The cost was the trauma of millions more. The cost was the devastation of entire nations.